Racist woman tells black man to go back to Africa. His response leaves everyone speechless. A grocery store. A normal day. People shopping, scanning shelves, tossing items into their carts without a second thought. The steady beeping of registers, the hum of conversations, the distant whir of an automatic door opening and closing. It was all part of the everyday rhythm. David was just another shopper blending into the flow. A tall black man in his early 30s, dressed in a fitted blue hoodie and dark jeans, casually making his way through the aisles. He wasn't in a rush. His left hand held a basket filled with a few essentials, milk, bread, eggs, while his right hand scrolled through his phone, maybe a text from a friend, maybe checking the time, maybe just muscle memory. Near the produce section, an elderly woman lingered over a pile of apples. She was small, frail, but with an air of stubbornness about her. Her short silver hair was carefully combed, her faded cardigan buttoned neatly, her shopping list gripped tightly in one hand. She muttered something under her breath, shaking her head as she picked up an apple, examined it, then put it back. David barely noticed her. He reached toward the oranges, his fingers brushing against a plastic bag, just as the woman turned her head. And in that moment, something changed. She saw him, and something in her expression hardened. A quick glance, a tightening of her lips, a shift in her stance like she had just spotted something out of place. Her hand still gripping the apple stiffened, and then she spoke. Loud, sharp, cutting through the grocery store noise like a blade. "You people don't belong here." The words didn't just land, they hit. They sliced through the air, jagged and deliberate, carrying the kind of weight that made people stop, turn, listen. David's fingers paused over his phone screen. He looked up, blinking, as if unsure if he had just heard her right. But she wasn't done. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" This time the words echoed. A hush spread through the aisle. The kind of silence that was almost unnatural, stretching between the shelves and bouncing off the linoleum floor. A mother, standing just a few feet away, gripped her child's hand and gently pulled them closer. A man near the frozen food section pretended to be interested in a bag of peas, but was clearly listening. A young cashier who had been chatting with a customer at the self-checkout craned her neck toward the commotion. A man stacking bread near the bakery froze mid-reach, his fingers hovering over a loaf of rye. David wasn't the only one who heard it. Everyone heard it. And yet nobody moved. For a few seconds, everything was suspended. David's heart thumped once, a heavy, deliberate beat. His first instinct? Walk away, ignore it. It wasn't the first time he had heard something like this. It probably wouldn't be the last. But then he saw it, the way everyone was watching. Some pretending not to, others waiting for him to react, waiting to see if he would fight, if he would break, if he would let it slide. His grip tightened around the handle of his basket. His jaw clenched just slightly, but his face remained unreadable. 1,000 possible responses raced through his mind. He could lash out. He could make a scene. He could turn his back and pretend she didn't exist. But something about the way the woman stood, defiant, unshaken, like she expected no challenge, made him pause. And then he did something she wasn't expecting. He took a breath. A long, deliberate breath. And he set his basket down. It wasn't an act of surrender. It was a choice to stand firm, a choice to speak. "Ma'am," he said, his voice even, steady, "do you even hear yourself?" The words weren't angry. They weren't aggressive. They weren't a shout or a threat. But they cut all the same. The woman's lips tightened further, pressing into a thin, hard line. She squared her shoulders. She wasn't backing down. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice sharper now. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." There it was, the challenge, laid out in the open for everyone to see. More silence, the kind that made people uncomfortable. David glanced around. He could feel the weight of every single gaze on him, watching, measuring, waiting. The old woman stood her ground, clutching her apples as if they might protect her. David didn't step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't do any of the things she was expecting. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let her words sink in. And then, very calmly, very deliberately, he tilted his head and said, "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" It was such a simple question, but it changed everything. The woman blinked. For the first time, she hesitated, and that was all David needed. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger. And now the entire store was listening. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. The kind of silence that settled deep into the bones of everyone standing there. No one reached for their groceries. No one pushed their carts forward. The store was still filled with people, yet somehow it felt empty, as if the only two people who existed in that moment were David and the elderly woman. She gripped the handle of her cart a little tighter as if bracing herself. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She hadn't expected that question. She had expected anger, a heated argument, a storm of shouting. But this was something else. David took another step forward, slow and deliberate, keeping his gaze locked on hers. Not menacing, not aggressive, but firm. "You said I don't belong here," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "That I should go back to Africa." The woman huffed, lifting her chin. "That's right," she said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. "This isn't your country." David nodded slightly, as if rolling her words over in his mind. Then he spoke again, his voice steady. "My great-grandfather was born in Georgia," he said, his tone almost conversational. "His father before him was born in Georgia, and his father, he was a slave. He never got the chance to belong anywhere. He was dragged across the ocean in chains, forced to build a land that was never supposed to be his. But he stayed, and his children stayed, and his grandchildren stayed. They worked, they fought, they bled, they died." The old woman's face twitched. The weight of history was pressing down now, whether she wanted to carry it or not. "You want to talk about who belongs?" David's voice sharpened just slightly. "My family fought for this country before you ever took your first breath. My grandfather fought in a war to protect this land. He put his life on the line for you, for all of us. And when he came home, he couldn't even drink from the same water fountain as the men he fought beside." A soft gasp came from somewhere in the crowd. The woman near the bakery was holding a loaf of bread in mid-air, completely frozen in place. A teenage boy standing near the dairy section had his phone out, not texting, not scrolling, just watching. The woman's fingers trembled slightly as they gripped the cart, but still she pressed forward. "That was a long time ago," she muttered, her voice quieter now. "Was it?" David's eyes didn't waver. "Because my father still remembers the first time he was called a slur in school. My mother still remembers being followed around in department stores like a criminal. I still remember the first time I was pulled over and knew I had to keep my hands where they could see them, just in case." A long pause. "My ancestors didn't build this country for me to go back anywhere," David said, his voice calm but solid. "They built it so I could stand right here, so I could shop in this store, so I could exist. I belong here just as much as you do, maybe more." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The woman's face reddened, though whether from anger or something else, shame, realization, discomfort, was unclear. A man in a baseball cap near the frozen food section shifted on his feet. "He's got a point," he muttered. That was the moment the energy shifted. It was small at first, a ripple, a crack in the foundation of the moment. But it was enough. Someone else nodded. "Yeah," an older woman near the bread aisle murmured. "We gotta be better than this." A soft hum of agreement rolled through the onlookers. The elderly woman's fingers tightened around the handle of her cart. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Because she wasn't just facing David anymore. She was facing everyone. David hadn't shouted, he hadn't cursed, he hadn't even moved much. But he had done something far more powerful. He had taken her words, turned them over, and handed them back to her. Not with anger, but with truth. And truth was heavier than hate. The air in the store felt different now. The tension still lingered, but it had changed, shifted. The old woman exhaled sharply. Her shoulders slumped just slightly, but she didn't apologize. Instead, she gripped her cart, turned stiffly on her heel, and walked away. David let her go, because this wasn't about winning. It never was. This was about something bigger. This was about making people think. And judging by the look on her face, by the murmur of the crowd, by the way people were still standing there, silent and thoughtful, he had done exactly that. David bent down, picked up his basket, and turned toward the checkout. A young woman behind the register gave him a small, uncertain smile. "That was incredible," she said softly. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone handle something like that before." David exhaled, a slow breath. "Sometimes," he said, "grace speaks louder than anger." As he reached the exit, he glanced through the store window. The elderly woman sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel, and for a brief moment, just before he stepped outside, their eyes met through the glass. She looked away first, but David knew something had changed. The silence stretched, but it was no longer the silence of shock. It was different now, heavier, full. The weight of what had just happened settled over the grocery store like a thick fog. People shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, at the old woman, at David. Some still pretended to be absorbed in their shopping, but their hands weren't moving, their eyes were. Then, from the back of the store, a voice cut through the tension. "He's right." It wasn't loud, it wasn't shouted, but it hit just as hard as the words that had started it all. A man in a baseball cap stepped forward, his arms crossed. He wasn't young, maybe in his 50s, with tired eyes and rough hands, a working man, the kind of man the elderly woman might have expected to side with her, but he didn't. "We gotta be better than this," he said, shaking his head. The old woman's body stiffened. It was one thing to go toe-to-toe with David. But this was different. This was her own people speaking now. She turned toward him, her mouth parting slightly, as if searching for some kind of rebuttal, some justification. But before she could say anything, another voice rose. "My father fought in that same war," an older woman near the bread aisle said, her voice trembling just slightly. "He always told me the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The words hung in the air, and suddenly the dam broke. "My grandfather was a firefighter," someone else said. "Saved people no matter what they looked like." "My mom's a teacher," a young man near the self-checkout chimed in. "She always says the world gets better when people stop making excuses for hate." One by one they spoke up. Not all at once, not in a flood, but in small, solid moments. Not just agreeing with David, standing with him. The elderly woman turned, her gaze bouncing from face to face. For the first time, she wasn't leading this moment. She wasn't in control. She had started this confrontation expecting one thing, a quiet victory. A moment where she put someone in their place and moved on. But this wasn't that moment. This was something else. Her face twisted, not in anger now, but something closer to discomfort, like someone had just forced her to hold a mirror up to herself, and she didn't like what she saw. She shifted her weight, gripping the cart tighter. Then, finally, she spoke. "I didn't mean—" The words died before they could even form, because she knew. David raised an eyebrow, waiting. He wasn't going to let her off easy. He wasn't going to rescue her from the moment she had created. And for the first time she realized she had no defense. Her fingers curled over the handle of the cart, her lips pressed together, and then, without another word, She turned. She wheeled her cart toward the exit, her movements stiff, her shoulders tense. She didn't look back, but the impact of what had just happened didn't walk out with her. It stayed. It lingered in the air, in the faces of the people left behind, the ones who had seen, who had heard, who would carry this moment with them long after they left this store. For a long second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then, slowly, a sound broke the stillness. One person clapped. Soft at first. Just a single, hesitant clap. Then another. Until suddenly it wasn't hesitant anymore. It was solid, strong. The store wasn't erupting into a standing ovation. It wasn't that kind of moment. But it wasn't silence either. It was acknowledgement, a recognition of what had just happened, of the truth that had been spoken. A young woman behind the checkout counter swiped at her eyes, trying to hide the fact that she had been crying. The man stacking bread finally set the loaf down and gave David a small nod of respect. David didn't need applause. He didn't need validation. He hadn't said what he said for them. But still, it mattered. As he reached for his basket, a hand landed on his shoulder. He turned to see a middle-aged woman, her face kind but serious. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for saying what needed to be said." David nodded, offering her a small, steady smile. And then, just as calmly as he had stood his ground, he picked up his basket and walked toward the checkout line. The energy in the store had changed, not just for him, for everyone. David placed his items on the conveyor belt, his hands steady, his heartbeat returning to normal. The hum of the store had started again, but it wasn't the same hum as before. It was quieter, more measured, like the entire store was still processing what had just happened. The young cashier at the checkout, barely out of her teens, with wide, uncertain eyes, scanned his items with slow, deliberate movements. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then hesitated. David waited. Finally, she found her voice. I've never seen anyone handle something like that before." David exhaled, a small, knowing smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Sometimes grace is louder than anger," he said simply. She nodded, still looking a little dazed. "I don't think I could have done that. I would have just—" She shook her head. "I don't know." David handed her his card to pay. "A lot of people feel that way," he admitted, "and sometimes it's easier to walk away. But silence doesn't fix anything. It just lets people think they're right." She handed him back his receipt, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. "Well, I just wanted to say thank you for not staying silent." David gave her a small nod before grabbing his bag and heading toward the exit. As he pushed open the doors, the evening air hit him, crisp and cool. The parking lot was bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun, casting long shadows across the pavement. And then he saw her, the old woman. She sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing. Her posture wasn't the same as before. The rigid, defiant stance she had held inside the store was gone. Instead, she looked small. David paused just outside the doors, watching her for a moment. For a split second, he thought about walking over, about giving her one last word, one last lesson. But he didn't. Some lessons don't come from more words. Some lessons need time to settle. And judging by the way she sat, unmoving, her hands trembling slightly on the wheel, this one was settling in deep. David turned away and headed toward his car. That night, as he sat at his kitchen table, his father across from him, he recounted the events of the day. His father, a man of few words, listened without interrupting. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head, just let David's words fill the space between them. When David finished, his father sat back in his chair, his hands folded on the table. A long silence stretched between them. Not awkward, not tense, just full. Finally, his father spoke. You did the right thing, son. David's fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup. I don't know if it made a difference, he admitted. She didn't apologize. She just walked away. His father nodded slowly. People like her don't change overnight, but you planted a seed. That's all you can do sometimes. Plant the seed and let it grow. David thought about that. About the old woman sitting in her car, her expression no longer triumphant, but troubled. About the people in the store who had started the day as bystanders and ended it as witnesses. About the young cashier who had seen something she'd never forget. A seed had been planted. Maybe the woman would wake up tomorrow and push it down, pretend it never happened. Maybe she would tell herself she was still right, still justified. But maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't. Maybe she'd think about it while she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. Maybe she'd hear David's voice in the back of her mind the next time she saw a black man in the grocery store. Maybe the next time she felt that instinct to judge, to say something cruel, she'd pause. Because now she knew the truth. Now she had to live with it. Across town, the old woman sat at her own kitchen table, an untouched plate of food in front of her. She wasn't hungry. David's words wouldn't leave her alone. She thought about her own father, the things he used to say when she was younger, the ideas she had been raised on, the beliefs she had carried her entire life without question. But now, for the first time, there was a question, a sliver of doubt, a crack in the foundation. She had spent decades believing she was right, but now she wasn't so sure. And that was the beginning of something. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened in the grocery store spread, not just in whispered conversations, but in real, meaningful ways. People talked about it. Neighbors who had never discussed race before found themselves having uncomfortable but necessary conversations. Parents told their kids what had happened, using it as a teaching moment. Employees at the store who had been silent that day carried a new awareness with them into their daily interactions. David didn't seek attention for what he had done. He didn't post about it, didn't try to make it go viral. But still, his actions rippled through the community in ways he never expected. And the old woman? She didn't change overnight. People like her rarely do. But something had shifted. She thought about David more than she cared to admit. She thought about his voice, steady and sure, not filled with anger but truth. She thought about the people in the store who hadn't rushed to her defense, the way the tide had turned against her when she'd expected it to stay on her side. She thought about how, for the first time in a very long time, she had been wrong. And though she didn't know if she'd ever see David again, she knew one thing for certain. If she did, she hoped she'd have the courage to apologize.